Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. Feel free to use the chat box for any questions. If we are unable to get to them during the presentation, they will be answered at the end. My name is Braden Knutson. I will be your host for this webinar. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Stories from the Past, Hidden Treasures of Genealogical Sleuthing, Searching for Kerlin's Well. James Tanner has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law at Arizona State University. He served for 2 years as an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army and 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He has previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 32 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog and Rejoice and Be Exceedingly Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren.
Howdy, how's everybody today? Well, we're going to talk about a place called Kerlin's Well and give you a little background. Rather than just being an interesting story, the purpose of having this kind of a discussion is to illustrate some of the aspects of genealogical research. What we're trying to do here is locate a place and a time, an event in an ancestor's life. In this case, my great-grandfather, Henry Martin Tanner, who was a early Arizona pioneer. First of all, I kind of inherited 2 mysteries from my ancestors, from my Arizona ancestors. The first of those mysteries was, where is Kerlin's Well? And that's an interesting question to start out with. The second one was, where are the overs and negatives? And the next, one of the next webinars that I give here at the BYU Family History Library will be on the overs and negatives. So you'll kind of have to wait to see what happened with that question. But right now we're going to talk about Kerlin's Well. The question of this is, one of the things here is that's important in both of these family mysteries was the function or the place of images in historical research. In both cases, the images or the lack of an image were instrumental in my interest in finding out what happened with that particular location. So where did they come from? Where did I learn about these different things? Well, first of all, we have what I found was a book by my great uncle, who was the son of Henry Martin Tanner. His name was George Shepard Tanner, and he wrote a book on his grandfather, or on his father, excuse me, named about Henry Martin Tanner, Arizona pioneer. Title goes on and on, but he included in that a picture, a photograph of a rock in northern Arizona, in which my great-grandfather had carved his name and the date. And so that was it. No explanation, nothing, no where was this place. It was just a picture. And then the second thing was that my great-grandmother was a photographer, and I'll go back into this, but she, the question there was, whatever happened to all her photos, if she was a professional photographer for many, many years, as was her father. Okay, so we're going to direct our attention to Kerlin's Well. And to give you some idea and background on this story, we're going to start by talking about this book that I mentioned, that mentioned my great-grandfather, and also mentioned this in another book called Colonization in the Little Colorado of the Joseph City region. And so there's there are a couple of mentions of this place out there that the pioneers stopped. Now, to understand this a little bit, we have to back up a little in history, because the historically, we know that the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who are also called Mormons, were uh, subject to a lot of persecution and mob rule in the eastern part of the United States, and were driven from their home in the time that this whole story begins in Nauvoo to and eventually left the eastern part of the country, and the entire population of the church and many of the people afterwards traveled across the country by wagons and by foot and by handcarts to the Salt Lake Valley. They didn't all settle in Salt Lake, and eventually they were sent by the leader Brigham Young to the various parts of the West, settling over 200 communities in the West. Part of that set of people were sent to a place called San Bernardino, California, which is a rather large city today. And that was my great-great-grandfather's family, Sidney Tanner. And my great-grandfather, Henry Martin Tanner, was born in San Bernardino back in 1852. So that kind of set the stage. Shortly after that, there was an incident that was called the Utah War, where there was a disagreement between the United States government and the people living in Utah at the time, who were primarily members of the LDS Church. And because of the polygamy and a few other issues, the national government, under the direction of the president, sent almost the entire United States Army to Utah to quell the rebellion of the Mormons. Well, when they got here, they found out that there was no rebellion. And so they ended up camping on the west side of Utah Valley, which is just across the lake from where I live today. Well, my great-grandfather, who was a child at the time, was taken by his family back to Utah as a result of this Utah War, and they settled in a place called Beaver, Utah. And Beaver was still there. A lot of these towns are still there. We can't characterize them as thriving communities, but they are persistent communities. Some of them actually do thrive. But he was raised there, and when he got married, he was just past his early 20s, and married Eliza Ellen Parkinson, and just after they got married, they were called by Brigham Young to be missionaries, colonization missionaries in northern Arizona along the Little Colorado River. Well, that meant that they were going to get a wagon and they were going to travel south through Utah, cross the Colorado River at a place called Pierce's Ferry, and then follow an existing wagon road across northern Arizona until they got to the place where they were going to settle. As they traveled across the country there, they followed the route of the early explorers, and we'll learn about that. So let's now leave Henry and Eliza traveling across northern Arizona in their wagon with a few friends, and we'll talk about northern Arizona. First Arizona explorations by Europeans were done in about 1853. So if you look at that date and you look at the dates of all the rest of the United States as far as exploration is concerned, you'll say, now did you mean 1853 or 1753 or 1653? Well, actually, this whole area of the northern Arizona Plateau, as we call it, and the Colorado Plateau was one of the last places in the United States to be investigated. In fact, it was it was even later than this before the last part of the country was mapped, and that was in Utah. So this was the last part of the country that got any kind of significant European exploration, despite the Spanish and everyone else being there for hundreds of years. This may have been visited by mountain men, such as Bill Williams, who was a famous mountain man in Arizona, a little bit earlier than that, but they didn't leave any records, and so we don't know if that actually occurred or where they went or how they got down there. Generally speaking, the mountain men would follow the rivers, and this is a place where there are no rivers and no streams and no place for anybody to get much water. That's the whole purpose of this whole problem here. So in 1857, the United States government hired a Army officer, Lieutenant Edward F. Beale, to do a survey across what was then called New Mexico or New Mexico and Arizona territory, and to see if there was a route across that area to the Pacific, to California. So that was his job. He actually started in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and began his survey across Oklahoma. And if you need a kind of a modern historical reference, he followed what is now called Route 66 across the United States from Oklahoma City down to Los Angeles, and he also the Southern Pacific Railroad and or the Santa Fe, excuse me, Santa Fe Railroad. Southern Pacific's in southern Arizona, and the now the freeway, which runs across Arizona. Okay, so all those ended up following the route taken by Edward Beale and his group. Now, Edward Beale is Wagon Road. Here's kind of a map of the Wagon Road that went across from eastern New Mexico. Follows if you superimpose this on the freeway, it would follow the freeway almost exactly all the way across the country. So his survey was extremely important in establishing a route that could be made as a road across the country. And if you know your history, you know that Route 66 was actually one of the very few first intercontinental, cross-continental paved highways that was built for speed traffic across the country. Anyway, his claim to fame, by the way, is he explored this route with 22 camels. It's called the Army's Camel Corps. And there's a couple of movies made about this and all sorts of stories and things about the camels. But really what happened was that it turned out to be a very, very interesting experience for these men. Of course, he got a group of Army veterans, people who were either in the Army or associated with the Army, to do this exploration. And of course, none of these people had ever seen a camel in their entire life. when they were given a bunch of camels that they shipped over from the Middle East and from the Mediterranean to use as a possible way of helping the Army cross the vast distances and dry areas of the United States. So in Arizona, the route goes from what's called the Zuni to the Colorado River, and it was pretty much directly west. And actually, the freeway goes a little bit further north at this point, so there's not the Zuni is about 15 miles south of the freeway, where it crosses the border between Arizona and New Mexico. In 1858, he returned to build the road that they surveyed in 1857 and built the road across the country, and then traveled back to Washington, D.C. Now, what happened to the camels? Well, the camel part of this is probably the most interesting part. First of all, the soldiers were not real thrilled with the camels at first, but after they had been traveling for any period of time, they realized that this was one of the best things that had ever happened. First of all, well, the problem with the camels was that most of the horses and burros and things and donkeys and stuff that they used for transportation were terrified by the camels. So every time they rode the camels in, all the horses would go wild. So it was kind of an interesting problem, but after they got used to the camels, Beale realized that they were the absolute best thing that had ever happened. He wrote a journal that's very interesting to read. In fact, it's online. in PDF format. You can download the whole thing and read it for free. Beale's journal is very interesting because by about the first few chapters of his journal, or first few months of his journal, he is absolutely the biggest fan of camels that ever lived. First of all, they could carry almost 1,000 pounds apiece. Secondly, they didn't need any water, even nearly as much water as horses. They could go for weeks or 2 weeks without drinking any water, which a horse couldn't do for more than a day or two. And third, they walked everywhere. They always worried about the stones and the rocks. They took these animals across this rocky desert without any trouble at all. They never had any trouble with their feet, unlike the horses. And they even took them up into the Sierras, into the snow, and they did just fine walking through snow. So they were like all around tank animals. In fact, after I read this, I said, well, the only thing wrong with the Mormon pioneers when they came across is they didn't have camels. If they'd come across on camels, those guys with the hand carts would have made it with 1,000 pounds apiece, and they wouldn't have been stopped by the snow or anything. So, this is kind of an interesting situation. But of course, camels did not become the popular item with the United States Army. And afterwards, they let the animals loose. Nobody really wanted them. What they didn't kill for dog food or for whatever, they just released them free into the wilds. And up until the 1960s in Arizona, when I was living as a teenager in Phoenix, there were still stories of camels alive and wandering around in the desert in Arizona. So you can see this is interesting. Now, what has all this got to do with genealogy? Well, yeah, what it has to do with genealogy is simple this. This is all what was happening. In other words, this is the background of this whole story of how my great-grandparents made it across northern Arizona and settled in a little place called Joseph City and never left. And how they got there and what they did on the way was part of this heritage that I have and my own personal experience of living so many years back up in the northern part of Arizona and spending so much of my time driving back and forth across the Colorado Plateau. So the first wagon started across Arizona, New Mexico in about 1858. And so it's called the Beale Wagon Road. And there are parts of Arizona, and interestingly enough, if you know where it went, and you look on a satellite view on Google Earth or on Google Maps, and look at the satellite view of northern Arizona along that part from Kingman over towards the New Mexico border through Flagstaff, you can actually see the wagon road still very plainly on the satellite view. It stayed there forever. Once they got that road built, it was there. Okay, so he built that first wagon road. By the way, I don't know, the background pictures are all taken from that area where we went looking, and this background picture is an actual picture of the wagon road. So this is what they had to travel through, and you can imagine you'd probably need a camel if you were going to had a choice of walking across this or riding a horse or a camel. During the construction of the road, they discovered this well. They call it a well, but it's actually a little bit of a canyon or a little draw with some water that stays there year round. And there was also a spring or a seep there that would keep the water running 24, all year long. This is important because you're wandering across this desert, which looks absolutely barren, and to find water was extremely important. They had to have water about every 20 to 30 miles just because of the horses and the way it was traveling back then. So they found this one, and there's lots of other these springs as they went along that they had to find. Now, one of the things that happened on this that's kind of interesting with Beale was that he his men had run out of water, and they couldn't find any of the. Of course, they had employed a couple of guides, and apparently the guides didn't know where they were going and had gotten them lost. And Beale got mad at the two guides they'd hired and told them that they could take off and leave, go back to where they came from, or he would shoot them, which that was their choice. And I think they left, and he didn't shoot them. But he, uh, they were out there, and they were getting extremely um, dehydrated because they had no water, and the horses were all dropping off like flies. And they rode the camels out to see what is happening. So Beale's out there on his camel, riding around trying to find water, and and they're looking around and they're talking, and he says, well, the problem is here we're seeing all these deer and all these antelope and all these other kinds of animals out here, and they can't live without water. There's got to be water out here someplace. And so eventually they figured out, well, the water is probably down in the canyons, in the washes. So they started walking up the washes, and eventually they found the ones that had water. And so the key was that these wells, or these springs that would be able to have, so that the pioneers and others could cross this part of the country, were only available if you went up the canyons, up these little wash canyon things with rocks. Okay, we call them canyons in the West. In the East, they're called runs or draws, and there are washes and all sorts of names for them, but that's how they were. And this particular one that they found was called Kerlin's Well, because Beale named it after his clerk, Kerlin. And he named almost everything he went along about somebody in his party. So that was kind of his idea, was we'll name something after everybody. This is where the Santa Fe Railroad, Route 66 and Interstate 40 went. Now, the pioneers in 1877, which was a few years after Beale, followed the Beale Wagon Road across northern Arizona, including my great-grandfather, Henry Martin Tanner. Now, okay, so I'd heard about this. I'd heard about the rock, and I'd seen that one picture of the rock in the book where he carved his name, and I'd heard about the Beale Wagon Road, and I'd heard about the possibility that there was a place up there where they stopped, and that this carving was supposed to be at a place called Kerlin's Well. And so I decided I was going to go find Kerlin's Well. I'd been around the plateau many years. I had my truck, and I was going to go up there and find this place. So we got some general directions, and we knew that it was just north of a little place called Seligman, Arizona, on Route 66. So we piled into the truck, my wife and I did, and we drove up there and asked some questions, and 2 or 3 at various places, National Park Service, whoever, National Forest, the libraries up there, any place we could find that somebody might know where Kerlin's Well was. Well, we found out pretty quick that nobody'd ever heard of it, first of all, and secondly, only very few people were even aware that there was such a thing as the Beale Wagon Road. That was another strange thing that nobody knew about. And in fact, in one of the towns in Kingman, there's a Beale Street named after him. So somebody knew he was around. So we got up there on our first trip up into to the north, and found out, they said, well, if it's out there, it's out there on this road that goes north of Seligman out onto the plateau. And oh, by the way, it's a private property, and in order to go across it, you have to sign in and sign out, and you have to get the day permit, which they have right there. And once you have the permit to get in, you can go in. And if you don't have a permit and they find you in there, they will arrest you, and they will fine you whole bunches of money. So this is protected property, so just don't go in there. So we followed all the directions and all the rules, and we went out there with our maps and our GPSs and our everything, and to find Kerlin's well. Well, so the first trip we spent up there, we did lots of driving around on dirt roads. And then we found a book by Jack Beale Smith. Well, that was interesting. And so I was at the time blogging, meaning I was writing a column or blog on the internet, and I decided I would chronicle my adventures of going and finding the Kerlin's well on my blog. So I started writing about what we'd found, what we didn't find the first time driving around on a bunch of dirt roads. Um, Nothing that even vaguely looked like a well, or even vaguely looked like anything that would have had a rock that looked like the well. And then we uh, found the book by Jack Beale Smith. But then what happened one day on Sunday, I was sitting at home and the phone rang, and the person on the other end of the line said, "Hi, are this James Tanner?" And I said, "Yep." And they said, "This is Jack Beale Smith calling you from Oklahoma City." And he said, "I read your article on the internet about the place, and I was just wanted to talk to you and tell you where it was." I said, "Well, thanks a lot." So we had a nice conversation about the Beale Wagon Road, and this guy's written books about the whole Wagon Road and Beale. And so I got a copy of his book, and I through interlibrary loan, and found all of the information that I needed to, and he had given me some what I thought were pretty good directions to getting to the Kerlin's well. I thought, well, it's going to be interesting. So then I said, I decided, well, I'd better find it on a map first. So I went to this is right at the time, actually, that maps started to become available online, but this was still not, they still weren't specific enough. But I wanted to find on a map where somebody had marked Kerlin's well. That would make it like really easy to find, because then I'd have a topographical map with Kerlin's well on it. I could drive right to it. So, or I thought. And so I went into the library and started pulling maps, and finally got it down to what I thought was a manageable area, which was probably around 100 square miles. And I thought, well, okay, so that's not going to work. But anyway, uh, I kept going through the maps. And then I was sitting there talking to one of my partners. I was a lawyer at the time, and I was talking to one of my law partners, and I was telling him this story. And then I said, well, I found this website of these people who had gone there, and it's like this YouTube video where it says, "Hey, here we are at Kerlin's well. Here's the rocks. Here's the carvings. Goodbye." And they said, and I said, this was some old geocache guys looking out for stuff. And my partner looked at me and he says, "You're really dumb sometimes." And I said, "Yeah, I have to admit that." But he said, "What did you just say?" And I said, "Geocache." And he said, "Duh." And I went, "Oh yeah, yeah, the geo coordinates. Somebody has the coordinates to this thing." Okay, well, I did. I found the coordinates. Okay, so that was it, and then I found it on the map. Oh yeah, now we're cool, man. We've got the coordinates, we've got it on the map, we've got an aerial of it, got satellite view. We're going to be really out there. That's going to really work. Okay, here's the second trip. My wife wasn't about to go until, of course, I had found it. We weren't going to drive around aimlessly on dirt roads in northern Arizona for another day or two looking for this place. Not that driving around on northern Arizona dirt roads is anything new for me, but here we go. So here we are, no more faked out, the real thing. We're back to Boquillas Ranch, where we're going to drive in and see if we can find Kerlin's well. So now we go out, and this is what it looks like, folks. You see anything you need that you want to stay at? Anyway, you can imagine crossing this in a wagon at about, 4 or 5, 3 or 4 miles an hour for days after days after days where nothing changed. So we're driving out there, and that's if you want the wide view, just in case you thought I was cutting out anything that you could possibly believe. Okay, so we're driving across there, and eventually here's what happens. Well, we keep going. We have our GPS, and we're riding back and forth. And my wife has the GPS, and I'm driving down the dirt road, and she says, "You just passed it again." And I go, "We aren't any place." And she'd say, "Nevertheless, you just passed it again." So we would drive back, and then we would drive over, and we'd hit some rocks and a cliff, and we'd get to the point where we couldn't move the car any further, so we'd back out of it, and we'd go back and keep trying. Eventually, we ended up going clear out of our way on a dirt road that seemed to go nowhere, but took us around on the map, took us around, which might get us up on top. So what was happening here was there was this mesa or rise in the land that had a cliff, and you had to get around that before you could get up on top. But once we got up on top, here we were, and there was the road. Right there in that picture is the twin tracks. The road on the left, in the extreme left, that's a dirt road. That's the related road from the future. The wagon road is that kind of place where there's two ruts in the dirt. And that's actually when you talk about Beale's wagon road, that's what it was. There's a little bit of a mound of dirt on the side where they cleared off some of the rocks. So that's all they really did. They didn't do anything else, but they made it so it was passable with a wagon. That's what it looked like. It was pretty. I mean, there were flowers up there. It was springtime. A few hills over to the side. Then we reached the point where the GPS showed us we were the closest to it. So we got out and started walking down a wash that was just level ground. And pretty soon the wash dropped off. And then in about a quarter of a mile or so from where we got out of the truck, it just suddenly dropped off with a cliff into the canyon. And right there was some water. And as you turned around and looked at the rocks, then there was a sign carved into the rock. Kerlin's well out there in the desert. Well, okay, so let's kind of summarize this. We're going to go on a little bit more, but we'll summarize how this occurs. First of all, the information came to me about an ancestor, and to verify an event in the life and an historical artifact, if you will, where the ancestor was supposed to have carved his name on a rock, or whatever other event would occur. Then we began to doing some basic research. The first research came from what we would call genealogical sources, histories, family histories, and traditions. The second part of it came from research in the libraries with books and maps. And the third part was the actual part, and that is where we got in the car and drove out and found the location. So those are the kind of the keys. Now, how does this apply? Well, let's give another example. What if this were a cemetery? What if this were an old settlement? What if this were any number of other places out there? That the same type of process works for finding any kind of a location out on the Earth's surface. So if you want to know where your people came from, you're going to go through this same process. You may have heard that your ancestors came from someplace in West Virginia or someplace in Tennessee or in Virginia or in Massachusetts. Eventually, if you want to follow through with that and have the actual experience, there's nothing that is quite as has as much impact on you when you can actually find a location where your ancestor had a specific experience. I mean, that's where you tie yourselves into your ancestors. And there was my grandfather's carving right on the rock, 1877, Henry Tanner, right next to the Kerlin's well sign. So why was this place so hard to find? Well, apparently a handful of people know where it is, but they're not about ready to tell anybody because there's very, very difficult problem in most historical artifact areas is that they have a tendency to be vandalized. And the people that know about this are very, very concerned that this extremely difficult to reach and hard place would become vandalized. And actually, there was almost no evidence that anybody had been out there for years. Um, Subsequent, they'd build a rather large cement dam in that canyon to back up the water for cattle, but that had been abandoned and silted completely up. I'm sure that many of the inscriptions had been covered when they built that dam, but this is what occurred. And of course, early pioneers had to write their names all over the rocks, so there's lots of places here where they're writing. Now you'll notice that the craftsmanship here for most of these is much better than the common, ordinary, modern vandal who just scratches his name in and tries to deface everything. So, and these are all the people who built the dam later and recorded all their activities on the sides of these very conveniently uh, coated rocks, so that all you had to do was knock off the coating and you got the white underneath. Actually, it's manganese oxide, if you really want to know what it is. It's called desert varnish, and it is created over millenniums of water running over these rocks and creates that coating. Okay, so there I am, much younger and much heavier than I am today, and standing next to Kerlin's well and Henry Tanner's carved signature. So the significance of this research is that this is the same reason we have museums. This is why we have uh, historical societies and preservation, because this is our tangible, real connection with our past, with our ancestors. And it's physical, and it takes effort to get there, and you begin to appreciate what they had to go through when they actually had to drink that water, and that was all they had to drink. And guess who else had to drink the water? The camels and the horses and the cows and the everything else that they had with them. So they're sharing the water with those lovely animals. Um, so this is how Kerlin's well is significant. Okay, so we're through with that portion of the blood. A little bit early today, not a full hour, but we'll talk about it. Anybody got any questions on this? We're going to put the overs and negatives off to another time. Well, then we'll thank all of you for attending today, and remind you that this is the Brigham Young University Family History Library, that the webinars are all archived on the BYU Family History Library website. If you go there, there's a link to webinars and classes, and that we have classes and webinars scheduled regularly at the library. And we thank you all for attending this presentation.